Good evening, everybody. A warm welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to see so many great friends of the Dominican Order and of the Angelicum present here, and so many members of the order, too. I'm really grateful for the presence of so many priest friends from both the East and the Western province, and also we have some diocesan presence here of alumni, so it's great to have you here, along with all of our special guests. My name is Father Thomas Joseph, or Thomas Joseph White, the rector of the Angelicum, and I'll say a bit more in a moment. But I'm here to first say something about this wonderful event beginning this evening and then especially taking place tomorrow, which is the annual Rosary pilgrimage. And to give a word about that, I'm going to invite up the promoter of the Rosary for the province of St. Joseph, who's also the associate director of the Dominican Friars Foundation. This priest to my left over here, Joseph Anthony Kress, is an energetic younger priest of my province who has been active in manifold important ways in his still early career. Father Joseph Anthony served as the Catholic chaplain at the University of Virginia for 7 years, from 2017 to 2024. He's been part of a now internationally famous podcast called Godsplaining, and he's, I think his ministry and that of others of his generation has been pivotal in the energetic moment of the Dominicans that's unfolding for us nationally, and in a way vividly that we see in this region on the East Coast, where all these young priests are doing so many things that are wonderful new initiatives, one of which is this Rosary province, which has just begun a few years ago, and which he's the promoter for and director of, and which is so successful. So he'll just say a brief word about that, and you'll see me again in a minute.
Thank you so much, Father Thomas Joseph. I wouldn't be here as a priest if it wasn't for Father Thomas Joseph. He was a professor of mine and very graciously gave me passing grades through my entire education. So I am very much indebted to him for that. But as Father said, I'm Father Joseph Anthony Kress, promoter of the Rosary, and if you'd rather not look at my face in real life, you can look at it up on the screen. But this entire weekend that we have is our third annual Dominican Rosary pilgrimage. And as this has started a number of years and continued to grow, and we're so blessed by the grace that God has given to us and how his mother has continued to intercede this entire event moving forward. But I want to take a step back and think about the Rosary, our Dominican life, and why we are here doing this work. Later this month, in October, we will canonize a new saint for the church, Blessed Bartolo Longo. He is a Third Order Dominican and has a tremendous conversion story where he rejected his past activities in the occult and in satanic worship. And all of that happened because of a Dominican friar who spoke to him truth and taught him how to pray the Rosary. And he spent the rest of his life promoting the Rosary. And that was built off of the promise that Our Lady gave St. Dominic that those who promote the Rosary will experience the salvation through her Son, Jesus Christ. And so he dedicated his life to promoting the Rosary. Throughout his lifetime, he enrolled over 180,000 people into the Confraternity of the Rosary. He built the shrine in Pompeii, the shrine of Our Lady of Pompeii, and this miraculous image there that shows both St. Dominic and St. Catherine of Siena in there. And so our work in this Rosary pilgrimage that we have this weekend is part of that mission, is to help promote the Rosary to save souls, to bring salvation into this. So tomorrow at the Basilica Shrine, the entire day, it is almost 12 full hours of Rosary party time. We have a full day's worth at the Basilica National Shrine. We will have preaching on the Rosary. We'll have opportunity for adoration and confessions throughout the day. We will also have a beautiful Rosary procession throughout the interior of the shrine with a newly commissioned and blessed statue of Our Lady, Queen of the Rosary. And we'll conclude with a vigil mass in the evening and then have a concert by the Hillbilly Thomists on the lawn of Catholic University of America as the sun sets in the evening. 12 full hours. Now, I want you to pay attention to this. The reason why I love this event so much is because it is the most intense, highest octane experience of the Dominican charism that you can have. It's preaching. It's the fruits of contemplation, the opportunity to enter into that contemplation in adoration and praying the Rosary. It is the devotion to our Blessed Mother who has claimed this order as her own. It is a beautiful liturgy and the chanting of the prayers throughout the day. And then it is celebrated in great fraternity in the concert. This is our Dominican life, this is our Dominican charism, and we invite you to join in that. And so I invite you all to join us tomorrow throughout the entire day. It is free, it is a non-ticketed event. All we ask is that you show up. And so for any of the more information, for the full schedule, anything else that you know or want to know, please see the website rosarypilgrimage.org or just show up at the shrine tomorrow. We would love to have you and see you with us tomorrow. So thank you for everything. Enjoy tonight, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. God bless you.
I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, but just before that, I just want to say to people, you know, the things happening in Rome at the Angelicum are, you know, in large part through the support a lot of you here have contributed, and to others around the country. The things that are happening are really amazing, and it seems to me stunningly providential that at this time when we have invested so many new human beings as leaders, priests and sisters working at the Angelicum, the new hiring of lay faculty of excellence, recruitment of scholars from around the country, around the world, but many from the US to come and study at the Angelicum. It's the largest center of Dominican study now in the world, with 120 Dominican friars and sisters doing higher degrees at the Angelicum, serving formation for diocesan seminarians, religious sisters, religious priests from all over the world, 105 nationalities, that in this historical moment where there's this tremendous renewal happening, we should have a second pope in recent times elected from the university, an alumnus, and the first American pope. So we're in this sort of stunning moment of growth and life. And it's in that context that we also want to think about what the Catholic Church has to offer today in our world, in our complicated, and we know in many ways, very tense American culture. And I thought of no one more important or expert in speaking to that than Father Michael Sherwin, a Dominican priest from the West Coast province, who is one of the foremost experts in Catholic moral theology in our time. Now, Father Michael's originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, and he studied as an undergraduate in Berkeley, which was a first way you can become an expert in moral theology in America in our era. And then he entered the province of the Holy Name, which has its headquarters in Oakland, California, and has a long tradition of elegant and bright pastoral ministry to people of the Haight-Ashbury and Berkeley world, to great effect and great edification. Father Michael completed studies at the University of Notre Dame with his doctorate in theology, where he came to know well figures such as Alistair MacIntyre, who he befriended. He later spent time working under the great moral theologian Serve Pinckaers, a Belgian Dominican who is often hailed as the most significant moral theologian of the 20th century. And Father Michael went on to hold the Pinckaers Chair at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, where he served for nearly 2 decades, before graciously working with me, and not without some political delicacy on parts of many, to enjoin him to come to the Angelicum in Rome, where he has joined our faculty some years ago. And he has served for several years now as the director of our Institute of Spirituality. This is an important subsection of our faculty that has historical connections to great figures such as the formidable Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, Carol Wojtyla, who did a doctorate in spiritual theology at the Angelicum, and Cardinal Paul Philippe. Father Michael has a well-known book that I heartily recommend to everyone, which is on the nature of human freedom, which surely is one of the most important conversation topics we could intervene on in conversations with our secular colleagues. This is a book called By Knowledge and by Love, Charity and Knowledge in the Moral Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, from our own Catholic University of America Press. And he's here to speak to us tonight on the topic, Christian Virtue in America's Nietzschean Wasteland, Thomistic Reflections. Please help me welcome Father Michael Sherwin.
Wow, those introductions always remind me of like attending one's own funeral. I end up wanting to, I want to read the works of that person. Now, who is that person? Okay. I too want to thank Father Thomas Joseph White for this invitation. It's a joy for me to be back in the nation's capital, and even though we're across the Potomac at the moment, and to really be able to say with gratitude that I'm only able to do this because of many, many other people's dedication, and for many people who made the work of people like Father Pincares. And I also think of those who put me in the direction of studying virtue theory. There was Alistair McIntyre, there was Ralph McInerney, there were a host of other friars who the world doesn't know. Vince Guaiardo, who put After Virtue in my hands in 1984, that symbolic year. So I think of all those people because we lost Alistair this year, and then we lost David Solomon shortly before that. So in memory of all of them, I speak on Christian Virtue in America's Nietzschean Wasteland, Thomistic Reflections. The wasteland grows. Woe to him who harbors wastelands within. In 1885, Friedrich Nietzsche placed these words on the lips of the mysterious wanderer who shouted them out at the beginning and again at the end of his song that appears in the fourth and final part of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Like a siren, this twin phrase becomes a cautionary refrain, alerting us to danger, the danger of the growing moral wasteland spreading throughout Europe and the world. The wasteland grows, woe to him who harbors wastelands within. This refrain expresses an idea that Nietzsche will articulate more clearly in his last great work, The Twilight of the Idols, whose subtitle is How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Nietzsche had become deeply incensed with what he saw as the inauthenticity of European society, an inauthenticity that he regarded as especially present in the English-speaking world. Unlike the growing agnosticism and even atheism of the nihilistic worldview beginning to circulate on the continent, especially among Russian novelists, the denizens of the English-speaking world seem to think that they can banish God but retain Christian morality. In this, they resembled the respectable German middle class against which Nietzsche was himself rebelling. Quote, they are rid of the Christian God and are now all the more convinced that they have to hold on to Christian morality. This is an English kind of consequential reasoning. The rest of us see things differently. If you abandon the Christian faith, at the same time you are pulling the right to Christian morality out from under your feet. Nietzsche continues, this morality is very far from self-evident. This point needs highlighting time and again. If the English really do believe that they know by themselves intuitively what is good and evil, if they therefore think they no longer need Christianity as a guarantee of morality, then this is itself merely the consequence of the dominance of Christian value judgments and an expression of the strength and depth of this dominance, with the result that the origin of English morality has been forgotten and the highly qualified nature of its right to exist is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. For the English of the 19th century, morality was not yet a problem, but it soon would be. Nietzsche foresaw that Europe's smug moral confidence, even in the English-speaking world, would not long remain. Unmoored from its true sources, Western morality would inevitably drift toward emptiness and the will to power. This insight is what has led many to regard Nietzsche as the prophet of things to come. At issue here is the source of moral obligation and of a culture's understanding of right and wrong. Nietzsche recognized that as Western societies rejected both classical virtue, with its metaphysical understanding of human nature, and the God of the biblical commandments, it began to embrace a fictitious and a domesticated understanding of morality, where rights and obligations are viewed as self-evident and intuitively known by all. Experience and his studies, however, had taught Nietzsche that the morals of the West, as affirmed by Victorian England and by Wilhelmine Germany, were far from self-evident. Moreover, Nietzsche was astonished to perceive that most people prefer not to be troubled by such observations, choosing to remain in the herd and just to get along. Nietzsche was thus one of the first to identify that a people could collectively choose to live according to a lie. Indeed, Nietzsche redefines lying as follows, quote, I call lies not wanting to see what you see, not wanting to see it the way you do. It makes no difference whether the lies take place in front of others. The most common lie is the one you tell yourself. Nietzsche holds that once we perceive the inauthenticity of received morality, we are confronted by a choice. Specifically, according to Nietzsche, those who have discovered the true genealogy of morality, that it is a fiction imposed upon us by inherited patterns of oppression, these enlightened ones must decide either to follow the submissive herd or to become truly and heroically independent by creating their own values to become their own lawgivers. As Nietzsche himself explains, quote, with a creative hand, they reach for the future, and all that is and has been becomes a means for them, an instrument, a hammer. Their knowing is creating. Their creating is a legislation. Their will to truth is will to power. Unquote. From this perspective, the moral wasteland in which we find ourselves is inhabited by two types of denizen. Those who follow the herd because they just want to get along and then just slip along, embracing the morality of the moment. And those who strive to create for themselves anew, apart from all questions of nature, divine law, or custom. When one looks at contemporary debates concerning gender, marriage, and family life, as well as recent conflicts concerning the character of rights and our life in society, we see that Nietzsche well foresaw what the world would become. But are conformity to convention, the shifting sands of convention, or self-creation in the will to power the only options? Or is there another path that Nietzsche failed to see? Elizabeth Anscombe's groundbreaking 1958 essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, that has sparked a return of interest in virtue, suggests that there is another path. Although, as others have noted, Anscombe offers a critique similar to Nietzsche's, she proposes a solution that marks both a return to a more holistic account of human nature, as well as a more restrained assessment of the sources of moral truth. Specifically, although she calls for a return to virtue and to the philosophy of nature that would render such a return intelligible, she is also acutely aware that the principles of moral knowledge, what the tradition calls the precepts of the natural law, are often misconstrued and misapplied. Societies, through bad practices and wicked formation, can habitually live contrary to the natural law. This insight points to the central role of the community in character formation, even, or perhaps especially, in the formation of our learning to live the central Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity. To see why this is, it will be helpful to look briefly, a little more closely, at Anscombe's argument. When Elizabeth Anscombe wrote her essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, in 1958, moral philosophy in Britain was locked in debates concerning the character of moral goodness, debates pursued between deontologists and utilitarians. Was the moral good determined by one's adherence to universal and impersonal formal rules, as Kant's categorical imperative, as the deontologist held, or was goodness instead a function of an act's utility toward attaining satisfaction or contentment, as the utilitarians held? The question was thus whether rules or consequences had priority in moral analysis. This debate would subsequently be replicated in about 10 years later in Catholic moral theology, in debates between what groups that have become known as proportionalists or new natural law theorists. Anscombe responded that these divisions are of little importance because both sides of the debate share the same unjustified and outmoded notion of moral obligation. Both sides affirm that the morally good act is one which we have an obligation to perform. Very good, but from where does this obligation spring? Why am I obliged to maximize the satisfaction of the greatest number, or to act according to impersonal universal rules? In essence, Miss Anscombe was asking the meta question, why be moral? British philosophy, she argued in the late 1950s, had no philosophical answer to this question. Instead, philosophers were continuing to employ a notion of obligation that was a vestige of their culture's religious heritage. A Christian, and I would say Lockean, notion of obligation based on divine law. Divine law as developed by the Anglican divines, who, like Locke, viewed the natural law as simply revealing the will. It was decoupled from any rich notion of nature. The natural law was simply seen as revealing the will of the divine lawgiver. This law conception of ethics gave terms such as ought or should a special moral sense, implying an absolute verdict that one is bound or is required to do the actions to which these actions refer. Anscombe noted that after the general abandonment of this Christian Protestant conception of divine law, ethics finds itself in a curious situation. Quote, "It is as if the notion criminal were to remain when criminal law and criminal courts had been abolished and forgotten. In this context, moral ought has become, quote, a word of mere mesmeric force, employed without any rational explanation for its binding power in human action." Now, up to this point, Anscombe's argument is strikingly reminiscent of Nietzsche's. She too argues that ethicists employ moral notions that spring from a Christian conception of divine law, and that the ethicists themselves have rejected this conception. They also, that is, Anscombe and Nietzsche, also agree that because of this common rejection, debates between ethicists miss the larger point of their common peril. They are like nobles fighting for sovereignty over an iceberg that is swiftly melting away. Instead of the Nietzschean option of creating personal values in a heroic act of will, however, Nietzsche argues that we should return to a humble analysis of human action and to the rediscovery of the principles of action that such an analysis perennially reveals. Specifically, what is needed is, quote, an adequate philosophy of psychology, which we learn subsequently is her term for a renewed Aristotelian analysis of human action, of human flourishing, and of the traits of character, the virtues that make this flourishing possible. Quote, "For the proof that an unjust man is a bad man would require a positive account of justice as a virtue. This part of the subject matter of ethics, however, is completely closed to us until we have an account of what type of characteristic a virtue is, a problem not of ethics but of conceptual analysis, and how it relates to the actions in which it is instanced. It can be seen that philosophically there is a huge gap at present unfulfilled as far as we are concerned, which needs to be filled by an account of human nature, human action, the type of characteristic a virtue is, and above all, of human flourishing." Anscombe went so far as to assert that we should stop doing moral philosophy until such a philosophical psychology is developed, because otherwise we will simply be writing nonsense. Now, it would be fun to see how the ramifications of this essay as it slowly percolated and went out. But one person I want to underline here this evening. It is not an exaggeration to affirm that Alistair MacIntyre spent more than half his life attempting to supply this moral psychology, but with this difference. MacIntyre believed that such a psychology must be centered in an adequate understanding of the history of moral inquiry and of its narrative character as lived within a tradition of inquiry. Not only will this provide us with a non-rationalistic, that is, a non-enlightenment account of moral truth, MacIntyre affirmed it will also help us understand moral error and disagreement, and as well as some of the means towards overcoming this disagreement. So, a little bit more on MacIntyre. MacIntyre at first responded to Anscombe's call by to provide an adequate account of human flourishing by developing a theory of virtue that rejected what he called, quote, Aristotle's metaphysical biology. MacIntyre soon came to see, however, that he was wrong, and this on two levels. First, although there is much in Aristotle's biology that is outmoded, MacIntyre came to see that any adequate account of human virtue must be based on some account of our animality. Human virtues are the virtues of a specific type of animal, and our theories of virtue must take this animality into account. Secondly, an adequate portrait of human flourishing must recognize that there are principles within us that are ordered toward this flourishing as toward their proper end. There is a dynamic givenness to nature that we are called to discover and to respect on the cognitive level and on the level of the spiritual desires of the will and our passions. Indeed, MacIntyre will affirm that the incoherence of contemporary culture is largely the result of its rejection of this causality. As MacIntyre explains in the prologue of the third edition to After Virtue, his subsequent reading of Aquinas had led him to deepen his understanding of this aspect of human nature. And this is a quote from MacIntyre. I had now learned from Aquinas that my attempt to provide an account of the human good purely in social terms, in terms of practices, traditions, and the narrative unity of human lives, was bound to be inadequate until I had provided it with a metaphysical grounding. MacIntyre was nonetheless still committed to offering a non-rationalistic account of how we come to know these metaphysical principles and live according to them. Thus, he adds, quote, "It is only because human beings have an end toward which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do," unquote. What MacIntyre means here is that it is precisely because we are metaphysically ordered to flourishing on the level of the principles of intellect and will that A, communities of virtue that promote this flourishing are possible, and that B, barbarous communities that are ignorant of the true nature of human flourishing can also arise. Because this orientation exists on the level of principle, we can wrongly apply these principles and teach others to do so as well. Thus, like Nietzsche, MacIntyre offers a genealogy of the Enlightenment's failure. Unlike Nietzsche, who only discerns a path for the solitary hero, MacIntyre sees that nature offers another path, like Miss Anscombe, a path for communities of virtue that, by promoting practices within a narrative of human fulfillment, developed from within a tradition of inquiry, offer hope for an increasingly dark world. Now, a full account of MacIntyre's understanding of virtue acquisition would require a lengthy and detailed study of MacIntyre's conception of practices and of the role that narrative and tradition play in promoting these practices. For our purposes, after offering a quick overview, I will suggest some of the implication of MacIntyre's insights for Christian moral formation in the virtues, including the theological virtues. MacIntyre defines the virtues in relation to what he calls practices. Examples of practices are the arts, sciences, games, as well as activities, the activities proper to communal, that is political, civil, and family life. These can be elaborate and formal or less so. It can be the Rotary, the Boy Scouts, working on the planning commission, being involved in the park and recs of your community, all the different voluntary associations that are ordered toward a specific communal good is a practice in his view. Virtues are dispositions by means of which we attain the goods internal to these practices. More than this, however, the virtues dispose us to attain the integral good of a full human life, understood as the goal of a narrative quest. The very virtues by which we attain the goods internal to practice sustain us as we move towards human flourishing. Lastly, we undertake the quest as part of a tradition of inquiry and in cooperation with others. The virtues dispose us to seek integral human fulfillment as part of a narrative history that is larger than ourselves. The virtues thus dispose us to attain this integral human fulfillment in community with others in a way that promotes both their good and our own good, our common good, while maintaining and advancing the tradition of inquiry in which we were formed. This is the ideal. MacIntyre thus develops his understanding of virtue in relation to three notions: practices, narrative, and tradition. MacIntyre focuses our attention on these three concepts to show that the principles of practical reason, which the tradition identifies with the primary precepts of the natural law, and the goods towards which they direct us, are not self-evident in either a Cartesian or a Lockean or a Kantian or even a Jeffersonian sense. Instead, we learn to act according to these principles and to pursue these goods by being initiated into the life and practices of a particular community. This instantiation has the character of an apprenticeship, whereby, under the direction of mentors who offer us standards of excellence to imitate, we learn in the company of others how to live fulfilled lives within our communities. This initiation occurs either well or poorly. Moreover, as noted above, bad practices and disordered loves can lead communities to become barbarously vicious. Instead of ordering their members toward integral human fulfillment, they tragically dispose their members to pursue false fulfillment and illusory goods. In the years following the publication of After Virtue, MacIntyre sought to identify more fully the ensemble of activities by which a community helps its members develop rightly ordered desires as a prerequisite to human flourishing. The task is daunting and the perils many. MacIntyre thus helps us rediscover both the amazing dynamism of human nature as well as the fragility of human culture. This twin truth has implications for Christian formation in the virtues. When MacIntyre considers Thomism as a tradition in three rival versions of moral inquiry, he faults 19th century Thomists for thinking that they share more principles in common with their secular interlocutors than they in fact did. Specifically, they had a false confidence in a shared knowledge of the natural law. Aquinas, MacIntyre reminds us, was acutely aware, on the contrary, of how disordered desires can blind us to moral good, and that, as a consequence, the human person, unaided by grace, was unable, quote, to live by the natural law and to achieve the excellences of the virtues, unquote. Far from leading one to despair, however, Aquinas, MacIntyre argues, sees this recognition of our poverty as part of the process whereby we receive the grace of conversion and thus grow in the theological virtues that this conversion brings to us. Although knowledge of God and the principles of the natural law were and can be discovered by non-Christians, this knowledge is strengthened by means of divine revelation of, among other things, the Decalogue. And we are empowered to live according to this knowledge by means of the life of grace. For MacIntyre, therefore, the Thomistic tradition of moral inquiry is lived from within an apprenticeship in Christ, he says it explicitly, and through the guidance of his church. From this perspective, philosophy as we know it, and this is key, as the systematic study of what we can know about the world from human reason alone, is itself the product of the Christian community, of the Catholic tradition of moral inquiry, and therefore depends upon it for its very existence. Secondly, philosophy so conceived does not supply what contemporary philosophers would call a sufficient ethics. I say this trembling, seeing the dean of the faculty of philosophy in the congregation, but I choose my words carefully. philosophy so conceived does not supply what contemporary philosophers would call a sufficient ethics. This is why MacIntyre refused to be called a virtue ethicist or a communitarian, because he rejected the notion that you could have a sufficient ethics on the natural level. Just as Aristotle, who in the Nicomachean Ethics both identifies the essential characteristics of human happiness and recognizes that they are not fully attainable, that perfect happiness would be the life of a god, that's how he concludes, MacIntyre asserts that the philosophical quest ultimately leads to the discovery of philosophy's insufficiency. In this, MacIntyre resembles patristic thinkers such as Clement of Alexandria, who see philosophy as a preparation for the gospel. MacIntyre further asserts that this was also Thomas Aquinas' view. More than this, Fra Tommaso de Aquino is himself a model of how one must live in order to see the truths, the strengths and the limitations of both Augustine and of Aristotle, in order to bring them together in the service of the truth. Specifically, Tommaso de Aquino lived a specific form of life that grounded the practices of daily communal life, meals, prayer, song, the liturgy, and labor, in the study and celebration of the scriptures and the fathers of the church, as ordered to the proclamation of the gospel. MacIntyre's extended study of human desire, especially in his last book, Ethics in the Conflict of Modernity, confirmed him in the belief that in order to see, to perceive, to embrace the virtues and goods constitutive of human flourishing, one has to live a certain kind of life, a life that disposes our emotions and our will to desire these goods and to live these virtues. In spite of the many forms of life that can dispose one to seek human fulfillment, these disparate forms share several features in common. As numerous studies in what has become known now as the biopsychosocial sciences confirm, see, for example, studies in emotional resonance, emotional regulation, emotional revision. But all of these studies converge to point that all healthy societies share certain elements in common. These societies employ and order rightly the ancient human activities of A, shared meals, B, shared song. We still, as Ted Gioia has pointed out, we still really don't know what the long-term effects are of shifting from a people that sings while it works, while it heals, while it loves, to a community that listens instead of sings these things, listens to them often in a solitary way instead of singing them together. So, shared meals, shared song, shared dance, and shared works of mercy, both corporal and spiritual, as Benedict XVI would point out, as well as collective forms of civic decision-making and reconciliation that promote community life. Moreover, the apprenticeship of the theological virtues and the life of grace is facilitated by one's exposure to all of these activities, even on the strictly natural level. Forms of apprenticeship in the arts, the crafts, the sciences, athletics, as well as that contact and interaction with the natural world, especially domesticated animals and plant life, that is essential to human health and flourishing. Ideally, not only do such practices help us to love and live the goods integral to human flourishing, they provide the analogies that facilitate our understanding and reception of the action of grace in our lives. The analogies that help us understand faith, hope, and charity, and how to grow in them. Importantly, this apprenticeship in charity and the humble way of growth it requires disposes us to see our contemporaries in a new light, to see that our enemy, that they are not our enemy. Our enemy are the unseen powers and principalities that have rebelled from the Lord and who now sow discord in the world. In this light, our contemporaries are the hostages of these enemies, and thus they deserve our compassionate understanding and attention. Victims, many of them, of bad moral formation, moral argument will often, at least at first, have little power to persuade them. But as Pope Benedict XVI noted, moral example can display to them a different and more fulfilling way of life, a way of living whose beauty and goodness will proclaim their truth beyond what our words can ever communicate. Now, one way of interpreting what I have just said would be to say that it is an argument for becoming something like a Catholic version of the Amish, where Christians respond to the challenges of contemporary life by returning to pre-industrial forms of rural farm life and craft industry. Now, although rural life and subsistence farming will always have a special place in my affections and will always play a role in any healthy society, it is not to this that I believe most of us are called. Instead, the forms of life and the forms of community to which MacIntyre calls us have more the characteristics of what the dissidents under communist oppression during the Cold War in Central and Eastern Europe called a parallel polis. Václav Havel, for example, in his extraordinary essay from 1978, The Power of the Powerless, described where things stood in Czechoslovakia 10 years after the crushing of the Prague Spring. Like Nietzsche, Havel became fascinated with the attractions of life in the lie. Quote, "Human beings are compelled to live within a lie, but they can be compelled to do so only because they are in fact capable of living in this way. Each person is capable, to a greater or lesser degree, of coming to terms with living within the lie. Each person somehow succumbs to a profane trivialization of his inherent humanity and to utilitarianism. In everyone, there is some willingness to merge with the anonymous crowd and to flow comfortably along with it down the river of pseudo-life." The discovery of the Czechoslovak dissidents, however, was that another way of life is possible. Indeed, Havel confidently affirmed in his essay that, quote, "The essential aims of life are present naturally in every person." This is Havel rediscovering the principles of the natural law. Havel had this confidence because of the experience of alienation that comes from living in the lie. Quote, "Individuals can be alienated from themselves only because there is something in them to alienate. The terrain of this violation is their authentic existence. Living the truth is thus woven directly into the texture of living a lie. It is the repressed alternative, the authentic aim to which living a lie is an inauthentic response. Only against this backdrop does living a lie make any sense. It exists because of this background. In its excusatory, chimerical rootedness in the human order, it is a response to nothing other than the human predisposition to truth. Under the orderly surface of the life of lies, therefore, there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, of its hidden openness to truth." Unquote. This fact helped Havel explain what was happening under the surface of Czechoslovak society in the late 1970s. A growing number of ordinary Czechs and Slovaks were refusing to live the lie, to post party slogans, to vote in rigged elections, to participate in sham consensus. This refusal was the first step. Next, there were those who began the positive quest to live in the truth about how, for example, the truth about how to make quality beer, one of the only places where they allowed Havel to have a job was working in a brewery. He didn't have the physical strength to do it, so the workers kind of protected him, and he did what he could, but he watched and he learned. The truth about how to make quality Pilsen lager, or to run an efficient grocery, or other homely truths about the arts and agriculture or the sciences. Havel explains that once a person attempts to articulate this to others, to organize meetings with other grocers, or to teach underground classes on making good Pilsen lager, or joins with others who wish to do the same, that something new is born, that Havel describes as the independent spiritual, social, and political life of society, unquote. Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, would later describe this same phenomena as the subjectivity of society. Gradually, people begin to develop, quote, parallel structures, or even a parallel polis, a parallel city, where the members of society can together pursue the real ends of human life. Havel has in mind here underground universities, theaters, trade unions, music groups, and any other association that provides space for the collective and free pursuit of the authentic aims of human life. Writing in 1978, Havel judged that this was as far as the resistance movement had gotten. He predicted, however, that one possible outcome would be for the peaceful collapse of the regime and the emergence of a domestic society where the state itself would protect and foster these intermediate associations. In essence, Havel sketched the features of the Velvet Revolution that would erupt 10 years later. For our purposes, the important fact is that for both Havel and the Catholic thinker who coined the term parallel polis, Vaclav Benda, this parallel society was never seen as separate from society, but as at the service of the larger community. These parallel structures emerged only in those areas of life where full participation and collaboration with our neighbors and our contemporaries was no longer possible. As soon as such participation was possible, then the structures were parallel no more, and the difficult task of an integrated public life in the democratic society with all its rough and tumble returned. Implicit here is the Augustinian insight, and we will conclude with this, that the division is not between government and dissident, or between civil institutions and religious institutions, but between those who love God and those who don't. And on that level, as St. Augustine reminds us, the citizens of the two cities are inextricably intermingled in this life, both in government and in the church. Thus, we are called to work together for the good of a secular society, as St. Paul says so forcefully, as he so forcefully reminds St. Timothy, as we saw on last week's second reading. Since God, quote, wills everyone to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, we are to pray for kings and for all in authority. Why? So that we may live tranquil and quiet lives with all reverence and dignity. Reverence, giving each thing its due. In the contemporary context of the destruction of traditional institutions of higher learning, MacIntyre's theory of moral development suggests that Christians should spend more time creating practices that instantiate the truths that the Gospels proclaim. For Christian culture to thrive and experience a new spring, a new generation will need to fall in love with and become emotionally connatural with the truths of the Gospel and the Creator God whom the Gospel proclaims. Experience suggests that the best way to instill this love is by means of holistic programs of physical, emotional, and social apprenticeship in the practices of human life, by means of song, dance, celebration, courtship, craftsmanship, whereby we come to understand, love, and cherish these timeless truths of nature and of grace. This is why MacIntyre concludes that instead of awaiting the arrival of Nietzsche's Übermensch, the heroic but solitary creator of his own values, What we await is a saint who will call us to new forms of evangelical community that embody the practices of liturgy, service, and evangelization. In other words, we await, quote, a new, doubtless very different Saint Benedict. Like the restless and dissatisfied Christians who followed Benedict's example, MacIntyre recognizes that we restless denizens of modernity also thirst, quote, for new forms of community within which the moral life can be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness, unquote. Besides helping future generations to love the good and beautiful truths of the gospel, it may also furnish the conditions for the birth and the education of a new Thomas Aquinas, a Christian genius to help us live the faith that animates our lives as we confront the new challenges of contemporary life. Thank you. Okay, so I've been told that we have 2 questions that we have time for. Do I see any questions out there? We have a microphone. He'll come to you. All right, question over here.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned the possibility of communities forming people in vice. I wonder whether MacIntyre ever thought about the implications of that when you have a system of competing communities, right? So communities, whether they be nations or even within a nation, are competing economically, for political influence, potentially militarily, right? So is there sort of a natural selection then for more virtuous communities or more vicious ones? You know, for example, if you have a community where people don't keep their word, or they don't make sacrifices for others, or they don't save for the future, that's going to have negative consequences for that community. So did MacIntyre think about sort of that intra-communal competition aspect to virtue formation?
Yeah, I think this is one of his long-lasting obsessions is how does one community win the argument? And historically, how does that occur? Norman Davies, in his studies of European history, one of the things that he underlines is that, for example, the victory of the Celts, genetically we know, the studies of Cheddar Man, for example, is that people have been living in Cheddar, England, since Cheddar Man was there. And Cheddar Man was living there before Great Britain was separated from the continent of Europe. That means that the battles were won not by violence so much as having better ideas. Celtic culture took over prehistoric Europe because it had more convincing answers to the other community's own questions. So MacIntyre focuses on, if you're going to win the argument, you have to learn the language of the other culture. And you have to learn the other culture better than they do themselves, so that you can show how your answers better answer their own questions. I think there are numerous examples where that is true. If you've ever read how the Christian missionaries succeeded in converting the Saxon tribes in Bede's ecclesiastical history, it's marvelously presented. One of the priests describes their life on earth like being in a mead hall. And this is before they invented chimneys. So you have these big, long halls where they're all in there with fireplaces and all this smoke. And so they have windows all along the edge of these mead halls. And he says that life on earth is like being in a storm, raining, cold, and the bird, and something that they'd all had seen, the bird flies into the mead hall and briefly is among warmth and light and good cheer, and then he flies out the other window. He says, our life on earth is like that sparrow that just flies into the mead hall briefly and flies back out. If these missionaries say they know what life is like before the mead hall and where we're going after, then we should follow them. And so it's being able to understand the vision of that other culture and show how the gospel message better answers their own desires. But of course, we also have to recognize, and MacIntyre didn't focus on this, there are spiritual powers actively working against people making this discovery. So that's why prayer and the life of the sacraments and grace is essential, because we need the Lord's help. It's the Lord's task. It's his mission. We're just participating in Christ's mission. But yes, MacIntyre does focus on that. He's focused a lot of attention on that. Oops, okay.
Father Michael, I deeply appreciated your reflections on how nature teaches us about grace. I was wondering if you had any personal or practical examples that you could share with us about that upon reflection.
In terms of how living the life draws people to the, yes. Well, I think there's several people in this room who could do a better job and have more experience of this than I. But I think falling in love with the true, the good, and the beautiful. Microphone. Yes. Thank you. So there are people in this room who could do this better than I, but I think there are numerous examples of people who are drawn to the true, the good, and the beautiful, and it has disposed them in their solitude to receive the gift of grace. I mean, two examples come to my mind. One that is very public, which is Edith Stein, when she was trying to comfort a friend whose husband was killed in the First World War, and she spent the night in the home of the widow, and she found a copy of Teresa of Avila's autobiography, and she stayed up and read it, and she just spent the whole night reading it and closed the book at the end saying, this is the truth. So she came through the beauty of her life and the authenticity of Teresa of Avila's life, aided by grace. So grace is not, she doesn't come to faith without the gift of grace. But that book in that room, in that house, was the occasion for her to come to see the true, the good, and the beautiful about the gospel message. And there have been many other things that had been leading her in that direction, including the method that her mentor had been teaching her. But yeah, there are many other examples of artists who have, through their devotion to beauty, have become open to the quest for the origin of beauty, whether they're sculptures or in the cinema or whatever it is. Many actors come to faith that way. They know they're involved in something bigger. The joy, the power that they feel in the moment of creation on the stage is bigger than themselves, and they undertake a quest. And grace is part of that quest. So it's providing occasions for grace. And so I think all of the different activities where you pursue something true, something good, something beautiful. The nature is still the garden where grace loves to dwell. And so people who go into forays into that garden, and communities who celebrate that garden. Whenever Shakespeare's characters lose sight of who they are, Shakespeare sends them into the green of the garden, green of the forest, and they rediscover old truths. And I think that many, many people. Dorothy Day, in her own account of her conversion, when she finally got pregnant after having an abortion, she wanted to thank someone, but who to thank? So that took her on a quest to discover the God who was at the source of the joy of this new life, Tamara, her daughter. So yeah.
Please help me in thanking Father Michael for his presentation.